Good rainy spring evening, each and every one of you. I'm Murray Levin, a longtime fan and supporter of the Free Library of Philadelphia. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to the second of our 5 programs in our series, Trust No One, Joe McCarthy and the Politics of Fear. Tonight, we're going to meet a man who's every bit as worrisome as Joe McCarthy. He started out as a messenger for the Library of Congress, founded the FBI, and shortly thereafter began pursuing communist radicals and dissidents for decades before Joe McCarthy arrived on the scene. Of course, I'm referring to J. Edgar Hoover, and our program tonight is called The Man Who Knew Everything, J. Edgar Hoover and Joe McCarthy. Our very special guest presenter is the distinguished Yale historian, Beverly Gage. At Yale, Dr. Gage is a professor of history and American studies, and she's the Brady Johnson Professor of Grand Strategy. Her courses focus on both Gilded Age and 20th century political history and social movements. Dr. Gage is the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded, a story of America in its first age of terror. And she is currently at work on a new book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the American Century, and we can look for it probably sometime next summer or fall. Be sure to keep your eye out for that. Dr. Gage is a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, and you'll often hear her as a commentator on either PBS or NPR. Now, I wanted to make sure that you know about an essay which Dr. Gage wrote back in 2014, which appeared in the New York Times Magazine. While researching her book on FBI Director Hoover, she located a complete and unabridged version of both a letter and package of blackmail materials, which the Bureau first sent to Coretta Scott King and later to Dr. King himself. The letter, as I understand it, used racial slurs, threats, and blackmail to suggest to Dr. King that he should commit suicide. As revealed by Beverly Gage in her essay, the letter makes clear that there are great dangers in domestic surveillance. And as she suggests, absent meaningful checks and balances, those to whom we entrust the enforcement of our law can sometimes act in ways which go horribly wrong. Dr. Gage will be pleased to answer our questions after her presentation, and I'll ask you to use the Q&A function during the lecture and type in any question you may have for her, and we'll try to answer all the questions at the end of the program. For more information on this series and to register for future programs, please visit www.freelibrary.org. And let me also give a shout out to Dick Levinson, to Susan Gould, to Andrew Nurkin, and to Irma Cavalli. These are the people who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to put this series together, and we owe them a real debt of gratitude. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Beverly Gage. Dr. Gage.
Great, well, thanks so much for that terrific introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here. I confess, when I first agreed to do this talk, that part of the reason for it was not only that I find Joe McCarthy to be a fascinating and still quite relevant figure for all of us today, but I also thought that this might be a good excuse for me to take a trip to Philadelphia, which is where I grew up And I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia and spent many of my formative years tooling around downtown Philadelphia, taking advantage of the wonderful libraries and museums and classical music culture and the many other joys of Philadelphia. So I will just go ahead and consider this a virtual return to my hometown and take pleasure in being there, at least in the imagination. So today, as the introduction suggested, I am going to be talking about two men that I have spent an inordinate amount of time with since my days in Philadelphia. Those are J. Edgar Hoover and Joe McCarthy. And in particular, I'm going to be drawing upon some of the research that I've done for a biography that I'm writing of J. Edgar Hoover, which is coming out in the next year or so. Hoover is really one of, I think, the major figures of American politics in the 20th century. And as you'll hear, he's someone whose career lasted for most of the 20th century. And so in taking on the biography, I've tried to capture the full sweep of Hoover's career and have spent about the last decade or so doing that research. Tonight, I am going to take one piece of that research, which is Hoover's relationship with Joe McCarthy in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and talk about some of the ways in which they worked together and were allies in common cause, but also were often at odds with each other, and often people who thought very differently, who had very different political agendas, and who in the end really ended up at odds with each other. So in the popular imagination, I think you say J. Edgar Hoover and Joe McCarthy, and people who know those names, which I should say is increasingly a generational story. When I mention those names to my current students, all of whom were born in the 21st century, sometimes they know who I'm talking about, and sometimes they're not so familiar with them. But I think for those of us who are deeply familiar with these two figures, when we think of them, we tend to think of them as really two of the great villains of 20th century American history, two men who worked in common cause, were allies, particularly around the question of anti-communism, but who used this moment of anti-communist politics in the late 1940s and early 1950s to really drive their own agendas, to promote themselves as political figures and political demagogues in some cases, and really to act as almost tyrannical figures within what's supposed to be an American democratic system. There's a lot of truth to that image of Hoover and McCarthy as these kinds of joint villains. But tonight, I would like to suggest that we also want to think about them actually as very different kinds of figures. While they were friends, while they shared a lot of the same social world, while they shared much of the same worldview, they were often at odds with each other. And to Americans in the 1950s, they really represented very different ways of thinking about the role of government, thinking about anti-communism, thinking about the early years of the Cold War. So by way of introduction, I'd just like to highlight a few of those differences. Then I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about them each as individuals, and then look at these moments from the early 1950s in which they really came to both work together and then really to clash with each other. One of the ways in which Hoover and McCarthy were not at all alike was in their approach to politics. Hoover was a great institution builder. He was the head of the FBI from 1924 to 1972. So half of the 20th century, a full half century in its own right. And he spent most of his time really interested in his own politics and his own career, but interested in building the FBI as an institution. He drew upon lots of ideas about professional government service, about the new security apparatus of the United States, in addition to some of his more kind of aggressive conservative and anti-communist politics. Joe McCarthy was a very, very different kind of creature. He was a headline grabber, as was Hoover, but he was also basically, a showboater who had almost no institutional abilities. And as a result, he actually had a very short career. As large as McCarthy looms in our political imagination, he really only exercised significant and influence for about 4 years, from 1950 through 1954, in contrast to Hoover's 48 years. Even during those years, McCarthy was, from the beginning to the end, incredibly controversial. Right? Democrats hated him, lots of Republicans liked him, but even within the Republican Party, you saw huge divisions over who McCarthy was, what he meant, what his style was all about. And that contrasts incredibly dramatically with Hoover and his status during this period. We tend to think of Hoover as this kind of universal villain. There are very few people today who want to claim a figure like J. Edgar Hoover. But in the 1950s, as you'll see, he was probably the most popular person in all of American politics. So even during this very brief period in which McCarthy is exercising his greatest influence, McCarthy is the controversial one. McCarthy is the one that many people hate and critique. And Hoover, by contrast, is almost universally, not quite universally, supported and revered, is incredibly popular, in part because, as you'll see, people conceived of him as actually an effective alternative to a figure like Joseph McCarthy. So those are two differences. And the last one that I will suggest is that as we think about this period, in part because Hoover was the lasting figure, Hoover was in many ways the architect of anti-communism in a far more significant and lasting way than Joe McCarthy, we probably want to think more seriously about his legacy. When we tell the story of Joe McCarthy, it's the story of kind of the quick rise and fall of a demagogue. We have lots of concerns about his political behavior, but in the end, we can tell a kind of comforting story of the way in which the Republican Party, the Congress as a whole, the American people turned around and repudiated the kind of politics that McCarthy stood for. It's much less easy to tell a story like that about J. Edgar Hoover, who came out of the Red Scare of the 40s and 50s as an incredibly popular, an incredibly powerful, an incredibly well-respected figure who came under criticism in various ways in later years, but in fact was never dislodged from his position as FBI director, and maintained a really mass base of support throughout most of his career. So I want you to keep those themes in mind, not only the idea that Hoover and McCarthy worked together in common cause, but they were quite distinctive kinds of figures as I get into talking a little bit about their joint story, and then a little bit about what it might mean for us today. My plan is to talk for about the next 20-25 minutes, and then we will pause and hopefully just have a conversation through the Q&A function. I should say I'm happy to answer questions about Hoover in general, not just about Hoover and McCarthy, because as I said, I've been thinking about him a lot in recent years, and of course he had a very long and storied career. So who was J. Edgar Hoover? He was truly a son of Washington and in many ways a son of the American government. He was born in the city of Washington, just a few blocks away from the Capitol, and he was born into really a civil service family. This is in the late 19th century. That's a pretty unusual thing. The federal government isn't very large at that point, but he comes out of an old Washington family, many of whose members had participated in the government civil service. And so this is really a very natural path for him to take as he grows up. As the introduction suggested, Hoover's first job in the government was actually at the Library of Congress. And this was really a critical moment for him, since we're here at a library talking about library-related issues might be of some interest. But Hoover came to the Library of Congress really as a cataloger during the years in which the Library of Congress classification system was just being developed and implemented. All of those little codes that we have, Dewey Decimal Library of Congress, on our library of books. And this was incredibly important to his career because it taught him really cutting edge methods of information management that he then went on to use at the FBI, where he really made his stamp as a bureaucrat and a paperman, and not so much as an investigator. Partly coming out of that experience, he's working at the Library of Congress while he's in law school. He happens to graduate in 1917, just as the United States is entering the First World War. And at that moment, there are lots of new opportunities opening up in government, and he moves immediately into the Justice Department. At the Justice Department, his first job is interning Germans. So we know a lot about Japanese internment in the Second World War. Hoover worked on a kind of original version of that aimed at Germans in the First World War. I'd be happy to tell you more about that if of interest in the Q&A. And from there, as the war came to an end, he was deemed to be so effective at kind of large-scale information management, at making these judgments about who seems to be dangerous to the American polity and who doesn't, that he's promoted very quickly at the age of 24 to take on leadership of something called the Radical Division, which is being created in the Justice Department, really the federal government's first peacetime effort to conduct surveillance of, in particular, left-wing organizations. He spends a lot of his early years doing that. He helps to orchestrate the Palmer raids, which were some famous deportation raids aimed at anarchists and communists. And he really has this political awakening as an anti-communist, as someone opposed to the kinds of socialist and revolutionary ideas that are becoming very widespread, not only in the United States, but around the world. However, in 1924, when he becomes director of the Bureau of Investigation, this small agency at that moment, there's some sense that a lot of that has gone awry, that it's not appropriate to continue on with those activities. And so for a period of his life, from the 1920s into the 1930s, he moves away from that kind of politics. 1924 is really the moment he takes over the Bureau. For that first decade, he's spending a lot of time kind of doing good government reform. He comes in really as a kind of progressive reformer who's going to clean up corruption and clean up some of the political abuses that had predated him. But by the 1930s, he begins to move, with the cooperation of Franklin Roosevelt, back into some of the political surveillance that he had been doing as a young man, particularly aimed at Nazis and at fascist movements in the United States, but also aimed at communists. So by the 1930s, he's moving back into this work that really escalates and expands during the war itself, though the United States is allied with the Soviet Union. And I think really the key point for thinking about Hoover and McCarthy is that by the mid-1940s, Hoover is once again kind of fully immersed in anti-communist work. And this is long before Joseph McCarthy is setting foot on the scene. I just want to highlight a few pieces of what Hoover is doing in the 1940s that really helped to set the stage for Joe McCarthy on the one hand, but also show us some of the ways in which Hoover is a very different kind of creature than Joe McCarthy. So one thing that he discovers during the war is that there seems to have been a rather concerted and self-conscious Soviet effort to infiltrate the American government and various American war programs, from atomic espionage down to kind of ordinary departments like Treasury. It's hard to judge in the 1940s exactly what the scope of this is, but it becomes an increasingly large part of the FBI's work. The FBI during the 1940s is also really beginning to expand its overall surveillance of the Communist Party within the United States, which is a relatively small organization, but a pretty committed organization, and one that had had quite a lot of influence on the American left in the 1930s around labor rights, around fights for civil rights, around anti-fascist movements, but that was also very self-consciously allied with the Soviet Union. So Hoover is very suspicious of the Communist Party, and well before McCarthy came along, had already built up an enormous apparatus of surveillance, of infiltration. They were wiretapping and bugging the Communist Party well before Joe McCarthy came on the scene. The last piece that I'll mention is that particularly beginning in 1947, Hoover really finds himself on the outs with the Truman administration. And so to promote his program, to promote in particular his anti-communist agenda, he begins working very closely with congressional committees, particularly the House Committee on Un-American Activities, but also other Republican-led committees in Congress. And he's already building that kind of infrastructure, those kinds of relationships, again, well before Joe McCarthy comes along. So by 1948, 1949, there are big anti-communist spectacles all the way already underway in the United States. The leadership of the Communist Party has been put on trial and convicted based on FBI evidence. There are a couple of really sensational spy trials that have taken place, probably most famously the case of Alger Hiss, who was a high-ranking member of the State Department, accused of various forms of espionage on behalf of the Soviet government. Hoover has played a really critical role in those, and he's also begun to work on a program that came to be known as Venona, which was a decryption program aimed at figuring out what Soviet correspondents, intelligence correspondents, at decrypting wartime correspondence that had been intercepted, and therefore figuring out who some of these quote unquote spies in the government might actually be. The point of all of this is that Joe McCarthy doesn't invent anti-communism, and in fact, well before McCarthy comes along, Hoover has built up a really tremendous institutional apparatus, some of which is secret, is all about espionage, some of which is about surveillance aimed at the domestic Communist Party, some is about mobilizing the American public behind an anti-communist agenda, and some of which is about working with particular politicians in Washington and particularly in the Congress to carry out his agenda. So all of that is in place by 1950 when this man we know as Joe McCarthy decides that anti-communism is actually going to be his issue and he's going to take it on. So enter Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy was a different sort of man from Hoover from the very beginning. He was a Wisconsin farm boy, not from a particularly distinguished family. He went to Marquette University, was sort of an up-and-comer. Unlike Hoover, who tended to be relatively restrained, McCarthy was sort of known as a brawler and a boxer and a poker player, and he took great pride in all of those pieces of his identity. He began his political career really as a circuit court judge in Wisconsin. He entered the armed services during the war, went on to vastly exaggerate his war record, but came back to Wisconsin in the mid-1940s as the war was drawing to a close with the aim of making a political career for himself. It was very well timed. The 1946 election favored two kinds of person. One was a new generation of veterans who were coming into political service. McCarthy fit that. The second was Republicans who, after many years of Democratic rule, after many years in which Franklin Roosevelt had been in the White House, Democrats had controlled Congress, had high hopes for reclaiming Congress in the 1946 election. And in fact, the Republicans win. McCarthy has a really quite ferocious primary battle and then electoral battle in Wisconsin, but somewhat improbably, only in his 30s, comes out ahead and is elected to the Senate. So he arrives in Washington in 1947, in the midst of many of the things that I was describing, this kind of rising anti-communist consciousness, lots of activity, but he himself is not particularly well known as an outspoken anti-communist. And in fact, he's a pretty ordinary politician in lots of ways for his first few years, but he from the first sets out to look for powerful men who can be sort of his mentors and guides in Washington. And one of the figures that he seizes on very early is, in fact, J. Edgar Hoover. So from the moment he sets foot in Washington, McCarthy starts sort of insinuating himself into Hoover's social circles, showing up at the horse races where Hoover might be, going to parties where Hoover might be, and they really develop a pretty ordinary political friendship. During the late 1940s, Hoover invites McCarthy to address the FBI National Academy, which is their police training academy. You know, McCarthy invites Hoover to go on his radio show. So they're friendly, they share a certain sensibility, they share a certain social world, but they're not particularly bound by anti-communism in particular. That changes in February of 1950, when McCarthy really for the first time becomes identified publicly as a very powerful, very outspoken, somewhat conspiratorial spokesman for anti-communism. His famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia in February of 1950 is often conceived of as sort of his launching moment as a national political figure. That is the speech where he stands and says, you know, I have in my hand a still disputed number of communists working in the American government. And he goes on throughout February and into March of 1950, making this speech over and over again, declaring that he alone knows of secret communists working in the American government and that the time has come to root them out. On the surface, this seems like the sort of declaration that someone like Hoover might appreciate and might be enthused about. But almost from the first, Hoover and McCarthy find themselves at odds. So partly, McCarthy's declaration that there are all of these communists in government suggests, in fact, that maybe the FBI hasn't been doing its job as well as Hoover might say. Why are they still there? I think more importantly to Hoover is the fact that McCarthy goes around boasting that he knows a lot of this because the FBI has been telling him all about it and has been sharing its files with him. Hoover often did share files with various members of Congress. In fact, he did share information with Joe McCarthy, but his one cardinal rule was that you could not tell people that this was what was happening, that if you were going to get information from the FBI, it had to be confidential. You had to be circumspect about it, and you had to protect the FBI's interests or prerogatives above all else. From the beginning, McCarthy doesn't seem like a very dependable ally in that program. And Hoover, as early as February 1950, is expressing real concerns about that. Those concerns reach their peak by March of 1950, when McCarthy makes another dramatic announcement. He says that he not only knows of dozens and dozens of communists hiding in the American government, but that he himself has identified the quote unquote top Soviet agent in the United States, and he's going to reveal this to the American public. Hoover finds this quite troubling as well, a step into the FBI's own prerogatives, and he finds it really laughable when McCarthy actually announces who he thinks this person is. McCarthy names a man called Owen Lattimore, who had been a kind of left-wing intellectual, a specialist on Pacific relations, but certainly not the quote-unquote top Soviet agent in the United States. Hoover knows this in part because he's busy decoding cables that are suggesting there really are some fairly serious Soviet agents in the United States, but that Owen Lattimore, for all that Hoover disapproves of his politics, is not one of them. So this is really only a month into McCarthy's role as a national figure, and he and Hoover come to blows almost immediately. McCarthy says that he knows this about Owen Lattimore, and he brags that when everybody goes to the FBI reveals its files to the world, they will find out that he is right. His Democratic critics also say, well, hey, let's look at the FBI files. We want access to them because we think they're going to prove McCarthy wrong. So Hoover finds himself in the midst of this kind of partisan storm. He is quite furious at both sides, but he's especially angry with McCarthy for dragging him into it. And in fact, in many ways, he begins to turn on McCarthy from that moment on. Hoover agrees to testify before a committee that is investigating McCarthy's charges, a Democratic committee that is hoping to prove McCarthy wrong. When McCarthy hears about this, he goes rushing over to Hoover's office, really in outrage. And I'll just read you very quickly a few quotes from Hoover's description of that confrontation, which was not at all friendly. He describes McCarthy running in and saying, you know, are you really going to testify before this committee? Why won't you give me the files? You have to release the files. Hoover absolutely refusing to do this, both because he wants to protect the FBI. He claims he does not want these files to be a political football. And McCarthy turns to Hoover and says, in Hoover's words, he was going to keep asking for the files. Hoover turns to McCarthy and says, I told him that was his prerogative, but I wanted him to be sure he was on the right track and to urge him to be very sure of his allegations and accusations. So a really tense standoff, a sense that they were not, in fact, on the same side. And in fact, Hoover goes on the next day to testify in front of this anti-McCarthy committee, saying that he is not going to release these files, and that in fact, he is not at all sure that if he did, these files would show what Joe McCarthy says that they would show. And one of the interesting things that happens in that moment is that many American liberals who are quite skeptical of both Hoover and McCarthy find themselves faced with a choice. And in that moment, they choose J. Edgar Hoover. They decide that if you're facing off between Hoover and McCarthy, Hoover is actually the more responsible, the more appealing alternative to a kind of demagogic figure like McCarthy. And so they rally to Hoover's side. And I'll just offer a few quick quotes from this moment in 1950, which are very surprising given our own perceptions of Hoover, but show us just how different the politics of that moment were. One is from the New Republic, which was a voice of kind of progressive liberalism in that moment as well as ours. They hear Hoover testify and they say, we confess that we were impressed. In fact, Hoover damned the whole McCarthy probe. Probably an even more surprising quote is from I.F. Stone, who was one of the great left-wing muckrakers of this moment, an inveterate critic of the FBI, but faced with a choice between Hoover and McCarthy, I.F. Stone declares that he is definitely on J. Edgar Hoover's side. And in fact, in this moment in 1950, he names Hoover, quote, the last champion of civil liberties left in Washington. So an improbable characterization from our perspective, but I just want to go on and get to one other moment of confrontation between Hoover and McCarthy, which suggests some of this dynamic and some of the ways in which, though they shared this common cause, they were really quite different. So that was 1950, sort of the beginning of McCarthy's time as a national figure. Over the next several years, Hoover and McCarthy kind of make amends and begin to restore their friendship, to work together in various ways, often to share information, though McCarthy is a little better about keeping that fact quiet than he had been in his very earliest moments. And when Hoover is, by 1953, asked about what he thinks about McCarthy, he says that he does think of McCarthy as a friend and an ally of sorts. I'll just read you a quick quote that he gives to newspapers around this time. He says, "I never knew Senator McCarthy until he came to the Senate, but I've come to know him well, officially and personally. I view him as a friend and believe he so views me. Certainly he is a controversial man, but he is earnest and he is honest. He has enemies, but sometimes a knock is a boost. When certain elements cease their attacks upon me, I'll know I'm slipping." So skeptical a little bit about McCarthy's methods, but at a point of trying to make amends from these earlier points of tension. It's worth noting that even as he's doing that, he is also setting out in certain ways to sideline and contain McCarthy in an institutional sense. Rather than work entirely with McCarthy at the Senate, he begins during these years to set up a relationship with the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, which is another big anti-communist committee and is really kind of a rival committee to Joe McCarthy, who thinks that they are going to be much more dependable, a little bit more reasonable than McCarthy. And he sets up a file sharing system with them, even as he's resisting some file sharing with McCarthy. He also begins to expand his reach into other political areas, sharing information with governors, with local officials, with the American Legion, in part to have this big network of people aside from Joe McCarthy that he can work with. And once Dwight Eisenhower is elected in 1952 and comes to office in 1953, kind of bringing in a Republican president for the first time in a generation, bringing the Republicans back into power in Congress, Hoover works very closely with the Eisenhower administration, which does not like Joe McCarthy, but does not want to confront him directly. And so they really set up a program of promoting the FBI and of Hoover as the responsible, thoughtful alternative to Joe McCarthy. So throughout 1953, Hoover's working very closely with Eisenhower to do that. Eisenhower is pretty self-conscious about saying, we don't want these kinds of outrageous accusations being made in the Senate. We want a responsible institution like the FBI to investigate allegations of communism and of espionage to come to real conclusions. And that's where power belongs. So in this story, Hoover's working with Eisenhower, he's working with other people in Congress, particularly other Republican committees. McCarthy doesn't like all of this very much, and by 1953 does have control of his own congressional committee, what we know of as the McCarthy Committee. And he is determined to kind of pull the attention back in his direction, and in some ways really to go to war with the Eisenhower administration over this question of how aggressive the anti-communist program ought to be. A lot of that comes to a head in November of 1953 when McCarthy makes a big speech saying, yes, the Democrats were terrible on this communists in government issue, but you know what, Dwight Eisenhower, you're not so great either. And this becomes a moment in which the Republican Party itself begins to split, largely around the question of whether to support McCarthy or not. Those who don't want to support McCarthy end up backing Hoover. instead. All of this then sets the stage for the moment that we all know as Joe McCarthy's downfall, which is the Army McCarthy hearings, which take place in the spring of 1954. The Army McCarthy hearings come out of Joe McCarthy's attempts to suggest that not only other parts of the government, but the Army itself has been harboring secret communists and has been much too soft on communism. The Army comes back and says, you're only attacking us because your staffer, Roy Cohn, wants favorable treatment for his friend and implicitly his boyfriend, a man named David Shine. And so you get a big standoff between Joe McCarthy and the Army that, as I said, results in the famous Army McCarthy hearings. There are a lot of kind of legendary moments that come out of the Army McCarthy hearings, which are televised for the American people. There is moments of innuendo about Roy Cohn's homosexuality, even Joe McCarthy's alleged homosexuality, about a lot of the drama around seeking preferential treatment for David Shine. There is the moment when Army Counsel Joseph Welch turns to McCarthy and says those famous words, you know, have you no decency at long last, sir? Have you no decency, when McCarthy attacks one of his, the young lawyers in his office who had left-wing sympathies. But there's also a key moment between Hoover and McCarthy, which I think is much less well known, but is really critical in helping to bring about McCarthy's downfall. And that comes really a few weeks into the Army McCarthy hearings, when out of nowhere, McCarthy does what he had done back in 1950 that Hoover found so enraging. He says, as he makes his accusations, he pulls up a letter that he claims is a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, showing that the FBI had warned the Army early on about communists in its ranks, particularly at a camp in New Jersey. And he presents this as the ultimate authority, right? Here I have it from J. Edgar Hoover saying that this is true. At that point, the committee proceedings stop and they say, we're gonna have to go to J. Edgar Hoover and find out if this is an authentic letter or if Joe McCarthy is lying once again. As it turns out, that letter is based on FBI information. It's quite similar to a lot of documents in the FBI's possession, but it is not 100% identical to what the FBI can find in its files. And so this leaves Hoover with a dilemma. He could go public and say, fundamentally, this is a correct document, though there are a few differences, or he can take this as a moment to say, I don't know what Joe McCarthy is talking about. I don't know what that document really is. Don't believe what Joe McCarthy has to say. And I think to our surprise now, he actually chooses the latter. He refuses to authenticate this letter that McCarthy is presenting. He conveys a message to that committee that McCarthy does not have the support of the FBI. And when the staffer who is sent to confront Hoover returns to talk to the Army McCarthy hearings, he says that Hoover has disowned the McCarthy document, and that's a quote, and by implication that he has disowned Joseph McCarthy. All right, I just want to finish with a few thoughts, both about where they go from here and what all of this might mean for us today. The Army McCarthy hearings, as we all know, are sort of the beginning of the end for Joe McCarthy. He's pretty widely discredited after that moment, and by the end of the year, he is subject to censure by the Senate. He spends a few more years there in the Senate, but he is really a lame duck figure. He is discredited, driven out of Republican politics, and ultimately drinks himself to death by 1957. Hoover, by contrast, emerges from these battles more powerful, influential, and popular than ever. In fact, a poll in 1954 asking Americans' views of Hoover suggests that 98% of Americans have either a favorable or mostly favorable view of how Hoover has been conducting anti-communist politics. And as you can imagine, 98% encompasses people really all over the political spectrum. Not only conservatives, that might be make intuitive sense to us, but also liberals, Democrats, all rallying behind Hoover as the supposedly responsible alternative to McCarthy. Hoover himself, though, is happy about this, but becoming increasingly troubled by the censure of McCarthy, by what he perceives as the loss of importance of anti-communism as the 1950s go on. So while he's very happy to be celebrated, he also goes about seeking new ways to carry on this program, maybe in more secret ways, in ways that won't be as controversial as what Joe McCarthy was doing. And in 1957, the same year that McCarthy dies, Hoover establishes a program called Cointelpro, which is a counterintelligence program originally aimed at the Communist Party, intended to not only conduct surveillance, but to actively disrupt its activities, to destroy the Communist Party from within. And he's doing it now in a secret way and not in a public way, because one of the lessons he took from the repudiation of Joe McCarthy was that the public was turning on that kind of politics, and therefore it had to be done more secretly. So in closing, I think Cointelpro suggests one of the ways in which the politics of this moment proved to have really lasting consequences. As many of you no doubt know, in the 60s and into the early 1970s, that program expands to target people really all over the political spectrum, especially the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. That letter to Martin Luther King that was mentioned early on is within the rubric of Cointelpro and these kinds of aggressive secret actions that the FBI decides to take on against groups that it doesn't like. I think another way that we can think about the lessons of this era are in what I described as a kind of liberals' love-hate relationship with the FBI during the 1950s, which I think we've seen certain expressions of in our own time, that though liberals and leftists were quite critical of the FBI in the 1950s, as in more recent years, in moments of crisis, forced to choose between the kind of institutional investigators of the FBI and the demagogues like McCarthy, or in our more recent iteration, Donald Trump. A lot of people discover they have faith in the FBI that they might not have in other circumstances. So I think that's been a kind of interesting set of historical parallels. But of course, if Hoover's legacy lives on, so does McCarthy's. And as I said at the beginning, I think there's a way in which, as we tell the story of McCarthy's rise and fall, 1950 to 1954, we can tell ourselves a kind of comforting story about the dangers of a rising demagogue and then his repudiation by the public or by Congress. But even McCarthy's story is not really so simple. Because even in his moment of censure, there are lots of people who still support his program, supported his methods, and believe that a tragedy has occurred in American politics. And they go on to found new organizations to carry on his legacy, organizations like the John Birch Society, organizations like the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade, that actually proved to have a really lasting influence in a revival of conservative politics that goes on to transform the Republican Party. And I think in many ways, we're still seeing resonances of today in the 21st century. So I am going to stop my formal remarks at this point and really open it up to the Q&A. I hope that gave you a few moments of history that you hadn't known about before. And I'm happy, as I said, to talk more about Hoover and McCarthy, but also to simply talk more about other aspects of Hoover's life and career, if of interest.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Gage. I think all of us have learned a tremendous amount and enjoyed your remarks enormously. There are quite a few questions in the queue already, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. One viewer asks, a question saying, I've seen a number of accounts of how Eisenhower dealt with McCarthy. What is your view?
Right. Well, Eisenhower was really a mixed bag in dealing with McCarthy. So Eisenhower, I think, quite sincerely never liked or approved of Joe McCarthy. But he was very hesitant about speaking out against McCarthy. So in 1952, when he was running, he originally thought, I'm never going to appear with Joe McCarthy on the campaign trail, but then he got to Wisconsin and did appear with Joe McCarthy on the campaign trail. And once he was in office, he did a lot of critiquing of McCarthy behind the scenes, but he took quite a long time to take any sort of action that really targeted McCarthy more directly. That was partly because he felt that it was undignified for a president to go after a mere senator, that he thought it was inappropriate for the presidency, and he had a sort of powerful sense of hierarchy. But it was also, of course, because he was very worried about these divisions within the Republican Party, worried about the political damage it might do to him. So in the end, he was a behind-the-scenes player. He helped to orchestrate the campaign that finally brought McCarthy down and sent lots of signals that Republicans who wanted to oppose McCarthy would have Eisenhower's support. But it was not exactly a profile in courage at all moments, I would say.
One member of the audience says, I hadn't heard about the internment of the Germans in the World War I era before. Can you tell us a little more about the scope, the duration, and how did it end?
Right, so it's a really interesting and I think mostly forgotten episode of history. But when the United States entered the First World War, they began a program of internment. It was different from Japanese internment because Japanese internment was a sort of mass internment program. So anyone of Japanese ancestry, whether you were a citizen or a non-citizen, beginning in 1942, was rounded up, put in camps, so more than 100,000 people. Because there were millions of people of German ancestry in the United States during the First World War, it was nothing like that mass scale, but about 10,000 people, non-citizens who were deemed to be threats to the United States, suspected of disloyalty, but also sometimes just outspoken critics of the Wilson administration. So for instance, the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra was German and was interned during the war. You actually had prominent scientists, a lot of people in the classical music world, which was very heavily German influenced. So about 10,000 people spent time in internment camps, often on very little evidence. And then the program just kind of petered out at the end of the war. One important thing to note is that that form of more selective internment also came back around during the Second World War, and the FBI was in charge of that. So you did have Germans interned, you had Italians interned, and Hoover was a big critic of mass Japanese internment, weirdly. It was one of his better moments, because he thought this kind of much more targeted, I can tell you who's disloyal, form of internment would be much more effective.
One of our Zoom friends points out that, as you said, Hoover went from being a cataloger at the Library of Congress to founder and head of the FBI in a relatively short period, and was probably still in his 20s at the time, or maybe early 30s. What were the qualities that enabled him to have that kind of an amazing career rise?
Right, you're right. He became head of the FBI at the age of 29 in 1924, and then he died there at the age of 77. So he was there a very, very long time. And I think they were largely administrative qualities. They were the same things that he learned to do at the Library of Congress: organize files. He had lots of energy for administration. He really was a believer, and throughout most of his life, in kind of good government reform and all of these kind of progressive ideals of the time, efficiency, anti-corruption, promotion on merit, professionalism, all of those things He had great energy for. He was a smart guy and very committed to them. And that appealed to people across the political spectrum. But he was always really a bureaucrat and a paper guy. He never investigated a single case of his own. And in fact, he was critiqued about that at various points, at which point in the 30s, he was pressured into showing up at a couple of actual arrests to show that he could really arrest people. But that was never his skill set.
Can you say something about Hoover's ability to deal with the media? It seems to me that over many years he had a very good relationship and was dealt with, and I'd like you to include Hollywood in that.
Right. So this was one of the sort of signature features of Hoover's career, although in many ways he also kind of got lucky. He wasn't naturally all that adept at public relations, but he realized at a certain point how useful it would be. He did have one great insight, which is that people don't naturally simply understand that their government is doing a good job, even if their government is doing a good job, that you actually have to sell the work of government. You have to convince people that you're doing a good job, and you need a mass constituency for what you're doing. And so he really tried to build that and built it very successfully.
And we're seeing some of that today, I think.
Exactly. This is a big question of the moment. There are people who say Barack Obama did a bunch of stuff, but he didn't sell it. And so he never got any credit for it. We can talk about whether that's true or not. But Hoover really knew that you had to sell it. And in the mid-1930s, he set up a very elaborate and quite aggressive and very effective public relations apparatus for the FBI. He also happened to luck into the fact that the film codes in Hollywood, to bring Hollywood in, were coming into being in the 1930s. There was a lot of worry that there were too many movies in which criminals were being glamorized and people were learning the wrong lessons from Hollywood. And so at the moment when he was just becoming a public figure, there also were new codes in Hollywood that said the policeman always has to win, the government always has to win. And so when they went around looking for a hero that could be dramatized, they happened upon Hoover. So he was also just lucky.
One question I can answer very quickly. One of our viewers asked whether this program is being taped, and the answer is yes. And it's my understanding that we'll get a chance to see Dr. Gage on the library website again, if you want to show it to some of your friends. Here's another question. And by the way, they're piling up, and I'm afraid we're not going to have time to get to all of them, but we'll go as far as we can. You're asked about the effect McCarthy had on civil society and whether you believe we could see again in our own time something that looks like a Red Scare or McCarthyism.
Yeah, I do think one of the most dramatic effects that McCarthy had, and really his method, right? When people talk about McCarthyism, you can mean anti-communism generically, but mostly when people talked about McCarthyism as a phenomenon in the 50s, they were talking about a political style that was kind of the quick hit, the big lie, the forcing people to name names, the kind of conjuring up of accusations out of nowhere. And that had a really repressive effect as people got very scared that they themselves would be named, that they would be dragged before the committee to name other people's names, et cetera. And it doesn't seem to me that we're at all insulated from that kind of politics. I think in some ways Trump was a very McCarthy-ish figure, just in his ability to kind of do something dramatic over here. When people started to say, wait, I don't think that that's actually true, rather than address, he would just do something really dramatic over here and make another set of accusations. So stylistically, I think there's still some danger there. And in moments of kind of crisis and emergency, you see that kind of constraint of opinion too.
One of our viewers wants you to look inside of McCarthy's head for a minute and tell us whether you think he actually believed what he was saying, or was it just a drive for power?
Did he believe what he was saying? I think that he believed in his cause. And which is to say, he believed that both the Communist Party within the United States and the Soviet Union more broadly, and the ideology of communism posed really serious threats to American politics and society, or as they would have said in the 50s, to the American way of life. So that I believe. And I think he also thought that anything you did in that cause was legitimate, that there was no excess that was too excessive to serve that cause. So those things I think that he believed. And then he was just a political operator as well. He loved the headlines. He was also an alcoholic. So a lot of this was driven by terrible judgment and by someone who wasn't always quite in control of his faculties. But certainly he was a self-promoter. He liked power. He liked being in the limelight. He went crazy when someone else seemed to be there. So that kind of ego and ambition was part of it.
There's so many questions here. We're asked about whether McCarthy used an investigation of the Osage Indians to try to professionalize the FBI. Does that make sense?
Oh,
I mean, Hoover.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of Hoover's early investigations, and I think it's an interesting episode. Is it Martin Scorsese who's directing the film about that episode that just came out? And Killers of the Flower Moon is a book that many of you may have read that's all about that episode. So yeah, it's one of many early cases where Hoover is sort of experimenting with conducting criminal investigations, which actually he hadn't had very much experience in, and does certain things better than others.
One of our viewers points out that it was assumed that several presidents were afraid of Hoover because they felt he had compromising information about them. Is there any proof of that? What's your view?
Yeah, I think that that's certainly true. And particularly, by the time you're getting into Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon, they are concerned that Hoover, Kennedy especially, who did not like Hoover, but knew that Hoover knew an awful lot about his girlfriends and his sex life and all sorts of things, covert operations, his ties to the mafia, all of that. So it's particularly notable in the Kennedy years. There were some concerns of that sort for Johnson and Nixon as well. Johnson famously says, I'd rather have him, inside the tent pissing out than outside. Yeah. So that's his famous quote about Hoover. So all of that is true, but I think the thing that we understand a little bit less is how much they also liked and depended on Hoover and how popular Hoover was. So he was very good friends with Johnson, and they lived on the same street. They walked their dogs together. They were very friendly, and Johnson really depended on Hoover politically in a lot of ways. And the same was true for Nixon. He had a very close, more than 2-decade friendship with Nixon. Nixon, when Hoover died, called him his closest personal friend in Washington. And they knew that Hoover had a very big popular constituency that they wanted to take advantage of. So we kind of know the scary Hoover part. I think it's almost harder for us to wrap our minds around the idea that people liked him and that he was actually quite popular.
A somewhat minor footnote, though, for folks around here, it's an interesting event, was the raid, which was carried out by a number of people in the media FBI office. I think it had to do with the anti-war spying and so forth. How did Hoover react to that, if you are aware of it?
Oh yeah, that's a big one. So that's actually my hometown. I grew up right around media. So in March of 1971, we now know anti-war activists from the Philadelphia area broke into the FBI office in media, stole all the files, and then proceeded to publicize them. And it was a really dramatic moment for Hoover. So in his exchanges with McCarthy, his interest above all else is protecting the secrecy of FBI files. And he managed to do that pretty effectively for almost his whole career until this moment in 1971, when these activists actually get hold of the files. And
some of them, I think, were college professors, isn't that right?
They were a Temple professor, I think a Haverford professor. Wow. And yeah, And we didn't know who they were. Actually, the FBI never solved the case, but about 5
Don't get any ideas for your book now.
That's right. Well, there's a great book on this called The Burglary by a journalist named Betty Metzger. And she's the person who really revealed the identity of these activists. And there's also a terrific movie called 1971 documentary. But anyway, Hoover was enraged and terrified when that happened.
I think we have time for just one more question. And let's see if I can bring it up. Oh my gosh. Okay. So here's a timely question. Senator Ron Johnson, also a Republican from Wisconsin, is being compared by several conservatives to the late Senator McCarthy, known for his communist witch hunt in the 60s. How do you react to that?
Right. Well, I probably don't know enough about the details of the accusation there, but I certainly think, as I was saying, that the kind of the political style of the Trump administration and then parts of the Republican Party in our own time really have adopted kind of McCarthy-ish tactics. You know, Trump himself was sort of a protege of Roy Cohn, who was there with McCarthy at the Army McCarthy hearing. So there are actually some very clear historical lineages, but I think also the culture of accusation, a certain kind of disregard for accuracy in such accusations, attacks on the integrity of government institutions as being corrupt, you know, even the kind of drain the swamp, anti-bureaucratic politics, all of that was part of the McCarthy swirl. So as I said, in this particular case, I probably need to think more about the details of that particular accusation, but I certainly think that form of politics is not gone.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of things I need to say and want to say in closing. First of all, I know I'm speaking for the whole audience in thanking you for a fabulous, interesting evening, Dr. Beverly Gage. I know there are a lot of people clapping, but we can't hear them on Zoom. Secondly, I do want to thank all the people who tuned in. We really enjoy having everybody with us, and thanks for all the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. The next time we're going to do a 2-hour with you. 1 hour will be the speech, then we'll do 1 hour of questions. How's that sound? And finally, I want to ask everybody to be sure and try to join us for the third episode of this series on Senator McCarthy. Thank you all very, very much. Good night.
Thanks. Good night.